Good morning, everybody. So I'm reading from Ecclesiastes 1 to 1:14. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities. All is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the stream flows, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. Where has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is says, see, this is new? It has been already in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things, yet to be among those who come after. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after the wind. You may be seated.
All right. Sorry. So yeah, we're having wrapped up our little mini-series on the role of the Holy Spirit that we started at Pentecost. We're moving into our summer series on the book of Ecclesiastes. And I'll just let you know from the get-go, we're not going to be walking through this book like we often do with books, just chapter by chapter, verse by verse. But instead, we'll do that today just to get the intro. But then we're going to be moving into looking at some of the major themes, like how the writer of Ecclesiastes speaks to the business of joy and happiness, or how the writer of Ecclesiastes speaks to the business of work and labor, or honor and wealth, or hope, all these things. And this is part of the wisdom literature in the Bible, which is its own unique sort of genre. And sometimes wisdom literature, and just the way it goes, it's a little bit easier to preach through if you just take the themes, and it also fits what we're going to do over the summer. So today, you just sort of get the intro. This is sort of what you have in today is sort of like the intro, overview, summary of the book, cover to cover. You go home today and you have lunch and maybe you strike up a conversation. So what did you learn today from God's Word? Vanity of vanities. Everything is vanity. Behold, I have seen everything under the sun, everything under the heavens. It is vanity of vanities, a striving after the wind. This is, and if you got that, you pretty much have the main point of the book. This is how he starts the book. If we were to flip to chapter 12, this is how the preacher ends his part. All is vanity. Vanity of vanities. And then in the 11 chapters in between, 40 different times, 40 some odd different times, he will say, oh, and I tried this, I saw this, I looked at this. Guess what? Vanity. Vanity of vanity. Striving after the wind. I mentioned a couple weeks ago, I'm maybe not the kind of guy that you bring in if you want to keep the good vibes coming at like a charismatic prayer service, right? I told you that story, how somebody made the mistake of bringing me in and having all the pastors preach, and they put me at the end, and mine was more of like a somber prayer of confession, I guess, but it just kind of killed the mood and killed the spirit. So I'm not the one you bring to that. I feel like the writer of Ecclesiastes, not the guy you invite to some joyful celebration or some happy occasion. Some of you have had graduation parties, for your kids that graduated. I feel like the writer of Ecclesiastes, he would just be sitting there in the corner with his punch, and then he'd be walking around. You know this is all vanity, right? This whole, I see your sign up there, which college you're going to and what field you're going to study, and vanity of vanities, I'm telling you. Or you wouldn't want to invite him to a retirement party. Right? You come to a retirement party and he's going to stroll up to you, with his coffee or whatever, and he's going to say, oh, so what did your 45 years of toil and labor get for you? You know you're going to die soon, don't you? This is all vanity. He would not be one you'd want to give a best man's toast at a wedding. Right? He'll talk about that. It was in chapter 7, I think, where he'll say, well, enjoy the wife that you love, the wife of your youth. Do whatever your hand sets you to do, because I'm telling you, there is no wisdom, there is no fruit, there is no life and goodness in Sheol, the grave, where you are going, he says, quite literally. Okay, so it begs the question, why are we taking our summer, right? Summer's the time, school's out, vacation season, going to the shore and whatever. It's supposed to be more chill, relaxed, whatever. Why are we taking the summer to look at this book whose main point is vanity of vanities, everything done under the sun, everything done under the heavens, vanity of vanities? I was thinking about that even personally. I've never had a desire or a spirit impulse to preach through the book of Ecclesiastes. I was going to say Revelation. Never mind. Ecclesiastes. And I haven't. And then just all of a sudden, over this past year, the book has just seemed more beautiful to me. And I'm trying to think, is that a midlife crisis I'm going through? That, it's vanity. What's the point of all this toil or whatever? I don't think it's that. I was thinking, I wonder if it was because, where'd Tim and Julie go? They were right here. Tim, there he is, he's in the back. Tim had us in our grace group working through the book of Proverbs. And Proverbs, I've often struggled with Proverbs because Proverbs seems very formulaic, and it almost seems like if you do this or you put this in, you'll get this, right? So the writer of Proverbs will say often, it is good for man to be hard at work and to invest in his toils. And if you go at your work with faithfulness and diligence and you avoid idle talk and just get to work and get the job done, your labor will return back to you with many reward. And I've often, forgive the analogy maybe, but I've often viewed the writer of Ecclesiastes as one, like my picture is him sitting in a sort of like a dimly lit Irish pub, where people go to wax philosophical. And in the table in the back is the writer of Proverbs, and he's got his guys around, and he says, it is good for a man to labor and to invest in it. It brings back good fruit. And I imagine the writer of Ecclesiastes sitting up at the bar, and he hears that conversation. And he turns to his neighbor and says, hold my beer. And he goes over and he says, really? What does a man profit, verse 3, from all his toil and all of his labor under the sun? Tell me. Generations come, generations go, and the earth remains forever. The sun rises up, it goes down, scurries back over to where it can do the same thing all over again. Really, what labor comes from you? I'm sorry, I'm looking at Tim over here like I'm preaching at Tim, like make us go through Proverbs, but no. It's all good. That's the beauty of the scriptures, right? That we have this thing, it's got all these different genres, and we have these genres called wisdom literature, which in many ways are wrestling with the nature, the business of life. And as they're wrestling with it, and the wisdom doesn't necessarily look the same in Proverbs as it does in Ecclesiastes, or it doesn't look the same as it does in the other wisdom book. You know what it is? Job. Right? And you can see even in that sort of the tension between Job's friends and Job, like you would imagine like the writer of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes would be having. Right? So that's part of the beauty. And maybe today, for lack of a better way to put it, the aim of this sermon as an intro is to just geek out on the beauty of what is Ecclesiastes and what is it doing in my Bible. For some of you, like, oh, these sermons again. Because, these intro sermons are kind of like that. We kind of have to, we'll work through our passage, but we have to give you this high-level view and answer some tough questions about the book, stuff that some of us geek out on and get excited about and just stand in awe of the beauty of the scriptures. Others of you are like, all right, let's get to next week and let's really get into it. Sorry, that's where we're going. Hang with me if you can, okay? You all right? You cool enough? I feel like it got warmer in here. It did. All right, well, here we go. Hang in it. First thing we have to do, we have to ask some questions of this. I'm really going to camp out a little bit on these first two verses. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king of Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Let's talk about that word vanity, because again, that's the most repetitive word throughout the book. What does he mean by this business? Vanity. All right, I'm reading now the English Standard. If you have the King James, I think it also says vanity. If you have the NIV, I think it says meaningless. Meaninglessness of meaninglessness. All is meaningless. We'll talk about that. Actually, the most helpful one, I think, is, I don't know if, probably nobody, if anybody would be reading out of the Message this morning, which is Eugene Peterson's paraphrase, not translation, but a paraphrase of the Scriptures. He actually translates that word very literally. He says, all is smoke. And that's what it means. All right? The word for vanity or meaningless and whatever in the Hebrew, it's hevel. And in the most literal sense, hevel means smoke or vapor. It's one of those words that shows up numerous times throughout the Old Testament, and often it looks like it means something slightly different. And that's why it's hard to pick which word is going to fully summarize and encapsulate this word. And that's why I think smoke is actually most helpful, because it gives us a picture that we can think about. I meant to bring a matchbook, but worship leading practice went on a little longer, so I didn't get to. But I wanted to strike a match so that you could see and then blow it out and just see the whiff of smoke that comes, right? And as you look at that, we could make certain observations about that smoke, such as doesn't last very long, right? It just, you see it, it's there, and then it's gone. It's fleeting. Right? And this would be a big thing for the writer of Ecclesiastes, because life for him, it just seems like that smoke. Like it's here, and then it's gone. It's fleeting. The days are few. Right? And so you can tell that the writer of Hebrews is one, or not writer of Hebrews, man, Ecclesiastes is one who's really wrestling with this problem of death and struggling to find how life works and what's the point of this, that, and the other under this pale shadow of death that just sort of looms, where we're here and then we're gone like a vapor. I feel like the writer of Ecclesiastes would go absolutely nuts sitting in modern day funeral services. Especially non-religious, funeral services, where everybody's trying to put our rosy spins on death and saying, oh yeah, Grandpa's fishing on the Great Lake up in the sky, whatever. Like it would be, the writer of Hebrews, why do I keep saying Hebrews? Ecclesiastes would be going nuts, saying, you people, don't you get it? There is this thing called death. We are all going into Sheol, and this is something you have to reckon with. He would be like those existential psychologists who that's their whole main target of therapy, is to say, yeah, so many of the problems we wrestle with is because we don't come to grips with death. And this is a big problem for the writer of Ecclesiastes. The other thing we could say about smoke, you can't grab it. You can't harness smoke. You can't take smoke and use it for whatever. Like, it's almost like, what is this thing? Like, you see it whiff and you go to grab it, and it defies ever being constrained or ever being, used or manipulated for my personal gain. Psalm 39, I'm going to read just real quickly from there. I think paints this picture of Hevel in verses 4 through 6. The writer says, O Lord, make me know my end. What is the measure of my days? Let me know how fleeting I am. Behold, you have made my days just a few handbreadths, and my lifetime is as nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath, stands as mere Hevel. And then he goes on, surely a man goes about as a shadow. Surely for nothing. Or surely for Hevel. Right? They are in turmoil. Man heaps up wealth and doesn't know who's going to gather that wealth. right? So he's also saying that life just has this incomprehensibility to it. Like you want to grab onto it, you want to subdue it, you want to manipulate it and use it for your personal gain and for your goals and ambitions of dreams, but it's going to constantly defy that, right? Just like that smoke would. If you ever try to grab that and harness that or whatever, it's going to defy that every time. So for today, and you'll see more nuances throughout the book, but for today, the two meanings of that word hevel that we're going to go after is this fleeting, and then this sort of like, I don't get it. I can't grasp it. It seems absurd to me. That's another word you'll see in some translations for that word. Absurdities of absurdities. All of life seems absurd. You in a good mood yet? All right, one more question. And I hesitated pushing on this one, but I think it's important to get a handle on the book. Who wrote the book? Yeah, there's the common answer. Solomon. Got a couple issues there. And again, I hate to mess with anybody's, preconceived ideas necessarily. But then Mike Plord would probably say, no, you like to mess with people's stuff. So I'm not trying to do that, but I do think it is important to the book. First of all, nowhere in the book do we have the name Solomon. All right, let's just get that out of the way. It never says Solomon. We've got verse 1 where it says, son of David, king of Israel, or king over Jerusalem. And so, well, that was Solomon. Solomon was the son of David who was king of Jerusalem. And I would say, remember that all the kings were all called sons of David, on down to Jesus, right? Who in the flesh, according to Romans 1, was son of David. And in his resurrection was son of God in power, right? All this sort of stuff. Like that's what you called the kings in Israel, sons of David. And if you keep reading further down in chapter 1, he says, I amassed more wisdom than all who came before me as rulers over Jerusalem. Almost seeming to imply that there were lots of kings prior to him. Biggest reason that today those who study the book would say, yeah, it's probably not Ecclesiastes, is actually because the language in the book is the language of several hundred years after Solomon was around. I brought a book to illustrate this. Teresa Quinn, I don't see her. She gave me this book about a month or so ago, The Gospel by Gen Z. It's the gospel written in the language of Gen Z people. Just for fun, I'm going to read you one. I'll read you the story of when Jesus calms the storm. It goes like this. Holy Blood and his fam got into a boat, and he took a nap. Then the sea and the wind were being extra and playing too much. The disciples didn't pass God's vibe check and were caught lacking and were stressing hard. So they woke him and said, bruh, you going to just let the storm cook? For they were afraid they were going to take the L and be unalived by the sea and wind. So Jesus said to the storm, bro, chill. And the storm said, say less, and stopped vibing. Then Jesus told them, have more chill, for it's not that serious. Trust. And they said, bro, what? How was that not difficult for him? In fact, it was barely an inconvenience. And so they were shook and said, haul up, is he him? Okay? Apparently this is how these Gen Z people talk. So if one day, 100 years from now, somebody's doing cleanup work in the parsonage over there, and they find this sitting on, in a shelf in the basement, right? And they open it up and they start reading, and let's say there's no title page that has the date on it, and they're saying, man, when is this book? Where is this from? Somebody says, I bet you that was written around 1980. And then the other person who would, maybe be more fluent in language and think, no, they didn't talk like that in the 80s. That's that Gen Z, right? And so this probably came out in 2020s and all that sort of thing. So in a similar way, there is language in the Hebrew, in the book of Ecclesiastes, that we don't have until much later. We have in the book of Ecclesiastes what are called borrowed words. Like every language has these. We're words that we have borrowed from another language. A classic example in English would be kindergarten. Like, what is that? Where did that word come from? how that we describe this first year at the elementary school. Or if I asked you, what language do you think that comes from? Kindergarten. Yeah, that's German, right? That's a German word. We got a German folk. I know that language. That's what my parents and grandparents speak, right? We've borrowed it, and that's what we use to describe this first word. So we've got words in Ecclesiastes. I wrote them down here. Words like pardes in chapter 2 and pitgum in chapter 8. And these are Persian words. Some of you are like, why are we doing this? Others of you are geeking out on this. Because, right, these are Persian words that came from the Persian Empire, right? And when in history does the Persian Empire show up? Yeah, after Daniel, right? The Israelites, they go into exile, right? The surrounding nations, starting with Assyria, they conquer Israel and they carry them off into exile. First the Assyrian Empire, and then Babylon takes over the Assyrian Empire, and then after Babylon comes the Persian Empire. And it was during the Persian Empire that they got to go back and, kind of resume some life. And lo and behold, we find in some of the things that are written during that time, some of these Persian borrowed words that they apparently picked up when they were in exile. So if you ask me this, and this is debatable, but if you ask me, this is a book that's written after that Persian Empire, right? So then begs the question, why are we spending time talking about this? Well, see, I think that's important to help you understand the angst of this book. Like, it's not just a book about a guy who goes off and sows all his wild oats and then comes back in the end and says, hey, I tried everything, and it's all for nothing apart from God and all that. More likely, it's written by people who are coming out of the greatest national and even individual trauma they had ever experienced as God's people, right? And coming out of exile, they were left with a million different questions, like, what just happened? How in the world did these surrounding nations with their gods come and conquer us and carry us off? I thought Yahweh was all-powerful. I thought Yahweh had entered into covenant with us. And so they're coming out with all sorts of questions, and they're coming out like, is God still for us? Is he still in our camp? And what's the deal with this? I thought, if you were faithful and you tried to be obedient to the law and you kept Sabbath and whatever, that God would protect you. Well, what gives? We just spent 7 years working through the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians. Which is to say that this is not just some existential philosopher who's just ruminating on deep mysteries of life. This is somebody who's also wrestling with God and is saying, I'm really struggling, God, to see the point of some of my toil and my faithfulness towards you. Right? Because we look at what's just happened. And death is just around the corner. Like, what is the point? And see, for me, I love that that's in my Bible. I love that because, wait a minute, we're allowed to do that? We're allowed to wrestle with God in the face of death. We're allowed to wrestle with God in the face of tragedy and trauma and heartbreak and to have legitimate questions. Hopefully by now you know the answer to that is yes. The Psalms are full of questions. People wrestling with God. Why, God? Why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from my groaning? How long, O Lord, until, right? And in many ways, like Ecclesiastes is the wisdom that is born out of some of those really tough questions. Okay? So maybe back to that original question, who wrote it? Probably your safest bet. I don't know if you notice it there in verse 1. You notice how it says, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. I think in your translation, probably preacher is capitalized. The word there in the Hebrew is kohelet. And it's debatable whether that's a proper name or not. It means the one who stands before the assembly, stands before the ecclesia, the gathering, the ecclesiasticus, right? And just gives wisdom, right? So more often than not, you'll hear me just use the word kohelet. And kohelet says this, and yeah. Anyway, we can talk more about that if we want. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going. And what I want to do is I want to just sort of, what's his main point here in chapter 1? Again, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And then here's the basic question that he's asking. Here's his question for today. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? Yeah, be careful about that phrase too. I see a lot of people reading into that, under the sun. Don't read too much in that. It's just a turn of phrase. Just like if I said, and if I lost my keys, and I said, where in the world? I could say, where under the sun did I leave my keys? Or if I saw you putting ketchup on a cheesesteak, I would say, what in the world? Right? It's just a turn of phrase, right? And that's why he uses it synonymous, I think, with under the sun, under the heavens, all of that. Either way. But the main question that he's asking, what does it gain a man from all of his toil and all of his labor under the sun? What do you get for all those years of hard work and toil? And then he starts referencing creation, what he notices in creation. This is what wisdom literature does. It looks around at the world and he says, generation comes, it strives, it goes after this, that, and the other, and then it goes. But the earth remains the same. It says the sun rises, and then it sets at the end of the day, and then at night, it just scurries back over so that it can get back to the place where it starts and do the same thing all over again, and all over again, and all over again, and nothing changes, right? The sun doesn't gain from it. It's never finally satisfied. It never has a retirement party. It never becomes more fit in all of its running so that it can make that loop a little bit faster each time, right? It's just what the sun does. The wind, too, just goes on its circuit. Goes down to the south, and it circles back around to the north. And you get the north wind, and then sometimes you'll get the south wind, and round we go. Or the sea. You ever thought about this? All these streams flowing into the sea, constantly. Millions and millions of gallons every day pumping into the seas and the waterways, and they're never full. You give your kid a bath, right? You put in a bathtub, you turn the water, you got to turn that water off because it's going to get full, otherwise it's going to overflow. If you go down the Brandywine Creek that flows into the Delaware, it's a bad example because that's kind of tidal, but eventually it's all going out to the ocean, millions of gallons pumping into the ocean. It's never full. It's never satisfied. Somebody can explain that to me someday. I don't know how that works, but it's never full. That's his whole point, right? Then he goes on to say the eye is always seeing, the ear is always hearing, but we're never satisfied. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There's nothing new under the sun. So there's this question. In light of that, what does it profit a man for all of his toil and all of his hard work? Nothing changes. Everything just goes around the same. So in one sense, the answer to his question is no major profit to write home about, or nothing too significant to speak about. The other thing that I think he's saying here, and I think this is important, I think he's poking at even that question and saying, like, and who are we to ask that question? Like, it's almost like he's saying, sometimes we forget that we are just part of God's creation. Right? We are creatures as well, too, right? And sometimes we think that, well, we've somehow been promoted to the role of the creator, and we can take and we can use creation and manipulate it and use it for our own gain and our own satisfaction, and we strive and we work at this. And he says, you fool, right? Look at the sun. This goes around, never changes. Look at the waterways pouring into the sea. It's never full. Generations come, they strive. Generations go, the earth remains the same. There's nothing new. But it's almost like he's saying, like who are you even to ask that question? That life should be for my satisfaction, right? I strive and I get a reward at the end of the day. See it? Let me keep going. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new, it has been already in the ages before us? There is, and then here's the final disgrace. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to come, or yet to be among those who come after. Any of you here know the first name of your great-grandfather? William. Hey, wow, good job. Anybody else? Thomas. Okay. Let me go back one more generation. How about your great-great-grandfather? So think about that, right? 3 or 4 generations. And the name, you can't even remember the name. We haven't even no recollection of the name. Like, it's just, it's gone. You strive, you go for this. Death comes for all of us. Creation refuses to be manipulated. And what is what will be. I, the preacher, been king over Israel and Jerusalem. I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. For I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after the wind. All right, have we hit that part hard enough? We have to do this before we tie it up. We got to jump to the end. Because I know some of you are sitting here and you're starting to get a little antsy because you've read this book several times. You maybe read through your Bible once every year. And so every year you come through Ecclesiastes. And you're like, but I know how this ends. Yeah, it's a lot of depressing, meaningless vanity, all this stuff. But then it gets in the end, and he turns it around in the last chapter, and he says, so here's the end of it all. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. And now all of a sudden everything has meaning, and everything has purpose, and everything has joy, and there's great reward for your striving. Except that's not how it ends. If you want, flip with me to the way the book ends, chapter 12. I'm going to pick it up in verse 9. Which, by the way, this is another technical point. Do with this what you want, but it almost seems like there's an editor to the book of Ecclesiastes who's taken all the wise words and proverbs of Kohelet and written them down into a book and is handing it off to his son. That's why, by the way, the book of Ecclesiastes is not just one to read when you're older. I've heard some people say that. It's probably not a good book to teach in youth group because it'll be disheartening, so read it when it's older. But no, it is a book of a father who's collecting these hard sayings of Kohelet, putting it down in a book and saying, hand it to you, and here, son, read this. You need to read this before you get too deep into life. So in verse 9 of chapter 12, he says, besides being wise, talking about Kohelet, who wrote all this meaningless stuff, the preacher, or Kohelet, also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. Kohelet sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth. Right? Ecclesiastes, hear it, is not the musings and the wisdom of a man who's running far away from God and who is being disobedient and unfaithful. No, it is written by somebody who is trying to be a faithful, God-honoring covenant keeper and who is trying to write words of wisdom that are upright and good and full of truth. And then he says this, the words of the wise are like goads or goads, right? These sharp little nails that shepherds would put at the bottom of their staff, right? And as they're working the field, their flock, and they're trying to get their flock to move out of danger into safe pastures, but they're not going because they're just content with whatever they got going on there. Occasionally, the shepherd would have to poke them with his stick, with the goads in there, and they would feel that, and it's painful, but it gets them moving in the direction that he wants them to go. All right? That's part of the summary of this book. The narrator is saying, yeah, this book sort of stings a little bit. It pokes at you. Right? But the goal is to get you moving in the right direction. They are given by one shepherd. He says, my son, beware of anything beyond these. Beware of trying to rosy this book up or add to it. Of making many books, there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. The end of the matter is this, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man, for God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Simple point is, what he's saying is, it's both and. Life is full of vanity, this chasing after wind and smoke. But here's our responsibility in light of that, or in the midst of that. Fear God and keep his commandments. It doesn't come with the promise then back end, and this will make everything full of meaning and life and goodness and blessing. Fear God and keep his commandments. This is your duty, and God will bring every act into account. Oh, how you feeling? You okay? Yeah. So why are we preaching this? Again, so here's going to be the job, I think, is to show you why this is good news, why it is like a go-ad that pokes and pricks at you, but yet is ultimately a good thing. And I think the part of the message for us today is this, or at least the way that the Spirit is using this in my own life. It is this sense that, we do have this mindset that I am entitled to things in life, and I am due things, right? And if I work hard, and if I be faithful, and I say my prayers, and I do what is right, I should get those things on the back end. Life should be okay and good for me. So I'm going to work hard, I'm going to be diligent, I'm going to be faithful, and I should get those things. And I'm going to go strive after all this. The writer's going to poke at that, even that mindset. He's going to say, you're forgetting your creatureliness. You're just a creature, just like the sun, just like the sea, just like the fields, all that sort of stuff. So where you get this notion that I'm entitled to progress and profit and change among all the other things in creation, But then when you start to see that, and then you start to wrestle with, and what's the point of all my striving? In our men's group yesterday, I love the men's group. There's so much wisdom that comes out of our Saturday morning men's group. And John, at one point, was saying just how, our desires have outpaced our ability or even creation's ability to satisfy those desires. Like so often our desires are just run amok, and we think we're entitled to this and we should have this. And sometimes those desires get so far out of hand that we get beyond even our own ability or creation's ability to satisfy those things. And we spend our life striving after stuff. And then it was Chris who said, and I can see how this happens, and I see it a lot in conflict that I have with, either someone in my family, where you get into conflict, and you'll get angry, and you'll bitter, and you'll be strive to win an argument, right? How many spouses have ever had this happen, where you start getting into argument, and you're going back and forth, and I'm not going to lose this one, and you're striving against each other to the point, and then at some point, doggone, I can't even remember what the argument was about in the beginning. Right? And meanwhile, you've said hurtful things, harmful things. There's going to have to be repairing of the relationship. And you're striving after what? And I feel like he's saying, hey, part of it is watch out for all that restless striving so that you can just enjoy the duty that is before you and what God gives you today. I was thinking about this, the month of May was end of year concerts and programs and whatnot. And for us, it was a little bit more somber because it was Callie's last time, having her high school chorus concert and her vocal recital and then her graduation, right? So we went to the concert and we went to the recital and to the graduation. And what am I doing the whole time? Either she's singing the solo in the choir or she's at her recital or, graduate. What am I doing when I'm there? I'm standing there like this, right? And the whole thing. Why? Because I want to seize that moment, and I want to grab it so that I can tuck it away and store it for future remembrance. So I can come back to it and I can look at it, right? And I feel like the writer would say, you're grabbing at smoke. And what's happening in that moment as you're doing that, as you're striving to grab onto that and hold it and save it away, you're not actually all that present in the moment. Like you're more worried about, am I zooming in quite enough? Am I getting this? And I'm not actually just sitting there and feeling the emotions of it. I'm not just sitting there with my arm around Amy as proud parents. And so the irony is that one day, I will be able to look at this screen and see the moment, but I will have no recollection of any kind of feeling or joy in that or sentimentality because I'm just sitting there. I won't even probably remember what Callie looked like in person because I'm looking at her on the screen and making sure I've got her in center and I'm not shifting, right? And I feel like that's part of what he's getting at. Right? You spend all this striving and to grab onto stuff so that you can use it for your benefit in the future. And you miss the simpleness, the beauty of what's right there for you. I feel like God was also hitting me on this, years ago when we were doing church planting out in Gettysburg and Adams County. And with church planting, there's all these goals and these benchmarks that you're constantly aiming for because you want to become a self-sufficient church, self-sufficient congregation, self-sufficient leadership that can run it, self-sufficient budget that can take care of it all, right? And what I learned halfway through is that when I'm fixated on those goals and I'm striving towards those goals, yeah, it feels tiresome and weary and labor. And then, irony of, well, not irony, but I feel like the writer of Ecclesiastes would say, yeah, and look what happened. God called you here to Wallingford even before that job was done. And you didn't even get to see the end of that. Right? But when I could slow down, let go of the striving after the goals and just be present in the mission and in the moment and in the life of the church. Oh man, it was sweet, it was beautiful, it was fun, it was exciting. And I feel like that's the wisdom that he would have for you today. Be careful of this mindset that you are entitled to something you owe, because if you have that, you're going to go striving after this, that, and the other. And in all that striving, what are you going to have to show for it at the end? Better is, as he will often say, to just enjoy the day that God has given to you. The simple pleasure, the simplicity of it, the beauty of it, and take it in. Now look, we got to close it up. But I feel like I don't want you all cursing me as you're eating lunch and in a bad mood. So let me also say this. Though I strongly do not believe the book of Ecclesiastes tidies everything up and puts a nice bow on it all, yet we can say this. This is other part of the beauty of God's revelation to us, is that it unfolds. And it's this unfolding drama of what God is doing in the world and in people trying to understand it and make sense and live accordingly, right? So we have the wonderful privilege of living on the back end of God doing this shocking thing and entering into all the futility of a curse-ridden, death-stained world, taking all that vanity and that struggle upon himself, hanging on a cross, facing up with death itself, crying out with all the generations that had gone before him, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Right? And then in that worked this shocking new victory and this newness as he comes bursting out of that tomb and new creation beginning to follow with him. Right? So I go back to the initial analogy of the guy sitting in the pub and Ecclesiastes writer, "He'll hold my beer," and he goes over and he puts the guy in his place. And then I imagine Apostle Paul sitting there. And Apostle Paul is sitting at the bar and he hears Proverbs and he hears Ecclesiastes going, and he turns to the guy, "Hold my beer." And he goes over and he starts to go through 1 Corinthians 15 with him. And he actually quotes some of Ecclesiastes, and he says to them, let me remind you of the shocking good news that Jesus has died for sin and that he was buried, dead in the grave, and God raised him in the newness of life. Right? And so how is it that anybody could ever say there's no resurrection from the dead or that death is all there is? Don't you know, if Christ isn't raised, he says, and he'll quote Ecclesiastes, "Let's just eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die." But the good news is that Jesus is raised. And how does he close 1 Corinthians 15? He says, "Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is never" what? "In vain." Why? Because the power and the curse of death has been broken. And now, eternity and new creation have been opened up. And now, the things that we strive for and we labor for, maybe still don't serve our agenda, but they have eternal significance. And they don't just fade away and have no remembrance anymore. But because of the certainty of resurrection and new creation, you can know for certain that the labor that God calls you to, that you work at, is never in vain. So be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. Amen? Amen. And so I think that's the call for us today. Be steadfast, immovable, abounding in the work of the Lord, taking the grace that he gives you today, not striving after just selfish gain, right? But fulfilling what is all your duty, to keep the commandments of God, to love one another as Christ has loved us, doing it clinging in hope that the power, the sting, the stain of death has been broken. So therefore, None of our labor for the Lord's sake is ever in vain. May God lead you in the joy of that, and may he help us to find the goodness and the sweetness and the beauty of that as we work our way through the book. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit we pray. Amen.